Section 5 of Philosophy of Glimpses with Javier Rivera, Thomas Jockin, and O.G. Rose. The section is called What Are Lacks? Thomas Jockin made the point that not all lacks are nothing, and that the conflation of these categories has deeply hurt our capacities to reason, especially to reason metaphysically. This inspired a paper called Lacks Are Not Nothing, and here I will try to give an account based on that paper to explain the difference between lacks and nothing. Section 1. Why aren't all lacks nothing? Well, imagine that our father yelled at us this morning and suggested that we are terrible at our job. Later that afternoon, we are alone in our living room and our dad is nowhere to be seen, and all we can think about is what he said to us. Is our dad nothing or lacking? Imagine we grew up with a neighbor. She became our best friend. We did everything together, and then one day she moved. She left. And we sit on our porch looking over at her house as the new neighbors take up residency silent. Is our friend nothing or lacking? And so on. Just because a thing is not around does not mean it isn't present. In fact, most of our time is spent toward things that aren't around. When I'm eating breakfast, I'm thinking about the report due that afternoon. There is no report around on the table, and yet I am making that nothing be here at breakfast. When I look at a cat and think, that's my cat, there is no my cat that the cat is wearing over its fur. Instead, I am making my cat be here even though it's not around, and so on. Is the report due this afternoon nothing? Is the reality that the animal is my cat fake? No, ideas are not nothings. They are no things with the no in parentheses or lacks, things that exist in a between space in the middle of presence and absence. And lacks are arguably the most important no things in our lives. For every idea is here and yet isn't. Every relationship is everywhere and yet nowhere. Nowhere, per se, with the no in parentheses, and so on. For more on this subject, please read Through Nothing We Know by O.G. Rose. But it is erroneous to think that these no things and lacks are just nothing. Section 2. Critically, Thomas Jockin penned an important note of clarification. There are lacks that are mind-dependent. Then there are lacks that are actual. For example, why did the bridge collapse? The bridge lacked support on the southwest corner of the foundation. In both cases, the lack is just as actual as the presence. In Thomistic terms, both are actual. In Aristotelian tomes, both are energei. That closes Jockin's quote. Personally, I tend to describe lacks in ways that are mind-dependent, but Mr. Jockin makes an important point that there are also actual lacks and or objective lacks, with the IV in parentheses. After all, a weak or collapsed bridge lacks support, regardless if I think it does or doesn't. The lack is part of the object. To play on the words a little, the objective of the engineer was to make an object that didn't lack support. And so, if the bridge weakens, then it is, in its objectness and relative to its objective, lacking. Now, perhaps it could be argued that this lack is an objective, or I can simply say that the collapsed bridge isn't a collapsed bridge, but that it is instead a pile of debris. By changing the definition of the thing in my mind, I can change what it is lacking, and even make the thing lacking nothing at all. By definition, by defining it as a pile of debris. But it's hard to believe the engineer of the bridge would accept this change of definition. The maker, who arguably is the authority on what the thing is, would probably say that the thing is objectively lacking relative to the formal calls according to which the engineer crafted various materials into the bridge. Relative to the engineer, then, the lack in the collapsed bridge would be objective and object-based, even if it wasn't such to anyone else, and arguably if the lack is objective to one person, let alone many, it is indeed objectively lacking. In the same way that if only one person in all of history ever experienced some rare bird, that rare bird would indeed exist. That all said, even if the engineer didn't claim that is a collapsed bridge and instead claims it is a pile of debris for some strange reason, it wouldn't change the fact that when the engineer originally built the bridge, there was an objective or goal relative to which it can be said the collapsed bridge is lacking. There must have been, because the bridge was in fact made into a bridge, and materials can't come together like that randomly without someone willing a formal cause. The chances of a tornado creating a bridge by randomly hurling the parts together are inconceivable, and even if it happened once, it would not change the fact that the high majority of bridges arose in accordance with formal causes, making the case outlined in this paper valid. Relative to the original design of the engineer, which the engineer could theoretically forsake, the lack is objective. This point, though, brings us back to Derrida, for we must ask if something is really objective if it can be denied or interpreted away. For Derrida, we cannot escape the text, which basically means we are always already in interpretation, and for that reason we cannot establish a solid and or stable identity, which by extension means we couldn't establish an objective lack. This is a strong point, as expected from a great mind like Derrida, but I think this critique can be addressed by maintaining a distinction between thinking and perceiving. Why? Well, the identity of the bridge as a bridge is primarily based on how it was used in thoughtless perception versus how it was intellectually understood. The pile of debris was in fact a bridge once that people would use to cross a river. There was a practical and lived reality that was once possible while the bridge was up that is no longer possible now that the bridge has fallen apart. And this is not a matter of thought, interpretation, or opinion. There was a physical reality that could be participated in, regardless what people were thinking, if at all, while crossing the bridge or studying it, whether about baseball, dinner that evening, and so forth. The possibility of a people walking across the bridge didn't blip in and out of existence based on what people were thinking. It was there in thoughtless perception, usable. The identity of the bridge as a bridge was primarily based on a perceived and object-based use, not an intellectual interpretation. Even if I interpreted the bridge as a bed for a giant, I could think that while still using it to cross a river. My thinking did not change the possibilities embedded in the objectness of the bridge. And when the bridge collapsed, those possibilities became lacking, even if for some strange reason I continued to think the bridge was still usable. In this way, object-dependent lacks are possible. Not all lacks are mind-dependent. The bridge was indeed once in time usable for crossing a river, and relative to that past, the present, or future in which the bridge is no more is lacking that past use. Time is real, and the fact that object-based lacks seem often time-bound would suggest why time would probably have a significant role to play in the phenomenology of a new metaphysics. Anyway, as of now, the thing named bridge now lacks the form to help me cross the river. I cannot interpret back the past ability or form into use to help me cross. Interpretation can only do so much, and considering this, there is reason to think objective lacks are valid based on thoughtless use and intention of the original engineer. Still, though some lacks are not mind-dependent, it does not follow that all lacks are necessarily objective. Perhaps they are, but that would be a different line of inquiry, a line that would require phenomenology. Could someone theoretically treat the bridge like a bed, thus suggesting that even the physical use of the bridge was susceptible to interpretation? Yes, but I don't think that matters, because even if we came up with 1,000 different ways the bridge could have been used, the possibility of using the bridge at all in certain ways is lacking. Now that the bridge has collapsed into a pile of debris, there is a range of physical uses and possibilities that are now lacking, and that is an objective fact. Perhaps a range of physical uses and possibilities suggests that we can't be certain that W is a bridge and thus used for X, but we can still be confident of such, and furthermore, we can at least be extremely confident that Y is physical thing Z usable for range 1 of possible uses, and that the range of 1 becomes lacking of Y once it ceases to be Z. In this way, Y can objectively lack both Y and range 1. A distinction between thinking and perceiving provides us a way to earn reason to think that objective lacks exist, based on both the intention of the engineer and use. But even if somehow Derrida's critique against identity through interpretation somehow stands in ways I don't fully understand, Derrida's critique still wouldn't deconstruct mind-dependent lacks. Personally, I don't think Derrida's critiques succeed in either field, but even if objective lacks are false, the efforts of a new metaphysics would still be justified. We live with our minds, after all. Section 3. A new metaphysics, which uses a phenomenological method focused on lacks, has reason to believe its subject is lacks versus wholes, and that it hence walks around the crater of a meteor versus nothing, because ideas, names, purposes, and so on are here and yet not. It would be strange to claim that ideas are nothings, seeing as the majority of our lives are shaped and oriented by ideas. Yes, we can make mind-dependent lacks disappear, in a sense, by slipping into pure perception and turning off our minds, but they come right back the moment we begin thinking again. It is because we are beings of perception and thinking that we can live between entities like ideas, love, and so on, all lacks. In addition to mind-dependent lacks, we also have reason to believe there are objective lacks based on design, intention, and use. What exactly is lacking from object? That shift from X to Y would be a valid line of inquiry for a new metaphysics, and a phenomenological analysis of X versus Y would prove useful for determining objective lack. That said, even if all objective lacks could be deconstructed with ontological redefinitions, as Derrida seems to have thought, this move is questionable at best for reasons already described, and furthermore, mind-dependent lacks would still be very real and relative. A new metaphysics focused on those and the phenomenology of our experience of them would still be valid. The directness and denial of perception in favor of thinking might be another reason why classical philosophy has struggled so much to discuss between entities, no things, lacks, and so on. Since phenomenology, that defines apart thinking from perceiving, is necessarily more dialectical than classical philosophy, as already discussed, then phenomenology is uniquely positioned to discuss between entities like lacks. If it is true that between entities are the most important no things and or lacks in our lives, then dialectical phenomenology is uniquely positioned to investigate what matters to us most. All right. If the methodology of the new metaphysics is phenomenological and its subject is mostly lacks, what is a phenomenology of lacks? What does that entail?